2022 Spring Seminar Series. I am very excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Michael Moore. Dr. Moore is originally from the United Kingdom and has a veterinary degree from the University of Cambridge, as well as a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is also known as WHOI. Dr. Moore has been based at WHOI since 1986, where he is the director of the WHOI Marine Mammal Center. He also provides veterinary support to the Marine Mammal Rescue and Research Division of the International Fund for Animal Welfare for their work with live and dead stranded marine mammals on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Additionally, he is a member of the NOAA Atlantic Scientific Review Group, which reviews NOAA marine mammal stock assessment reports for the U.S. East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. Dr. Moore's research encompasses the forensic analysis of marine mammal mortalities, the interaction of natural and man-made impacts on fish and marine mammal stocks, development of systems to enhance medical intervention with large whales, and the pathophysiology of marine mammal diving. He is currently assessing North Atlantic right whale health using aerial photogrammetry and is working with a group of stakeholders to establish buoyless on-demand fishing systems as a viable tool to remove line from the water column and minimize large whale entanglement risks. Today, he will be reading and discussing his new book, We Are All Whalers. And with that, I will pass it on to Dr. Moore.
Well, thanks, Matt, and it's good to see you all, and thanks for the invitation to give this talk here. So, the book, We Are All Whalers, and I'll talk about the title in a minute, was published in 2021 by the University of Chicago Press, and I want to acknowledge my editor, Joe Kalamia, who really understood better than I did what I was trying to say, and really grateful for the support he's given me through the time that we spent together, which was really important. And it's something that I'd never written a book before, and the privilege of having an editor, and especially a copy editor, is huge. And one day I hope you all, maybe you already have, get that privilege, because you learn a lot, and it was fun to do in spite of the work. So, without further ado, this video I took with a drone in 2019 of two North Atlantic right whales just skim feeding in Cape Cod Bay, and I'd like to read a passage from the very beginning of the book in the preface. Recently, I spent an early April day in the southwestern corner of Cape Cod Bay in eastern Massachusetts, in the United States, with a friend. He had been at sea his entire working life, but had never knowingly been close to a right whale. His day job was master of an oil tanker on the Valdez to Alaska, San Francisco, California run, where he might have been close to a North Pacific right whale. He was vastly overqualified to skipper our boat, which he did while I piloted a small drone to measure the lengths and widths of the many feeding North Atlantic right whales that we had found in a small area. There was no wind that day. The sea was like a mill pond, and it was crisp, cold, sunny, and quiet. We shut down the motor, drifted, watched, and listened. As each animal surfaced, exhaled, and immediately inhaled, we listened to the unique cadence of their breaths, and we watched their steady progress through the water with their mouths wide open, filtering the clouds of food close to the surface. Periodically, they slowly closed on the boat. We could see into their open mouths with small eddies of water peeling away from their lips. Much larger eddies formed in their wakes as their powerful tails and bodies as rudders to keep themselves within the food patches. This went on all day. As the sun started to sink behind the cliffs on the nearby western shore of Cape Cod Bay, their creamy white upper jaws, just visible above the surface, turned to a vibrant golden hue. It was a peaceful, majestic, and timeless sight, and a huge privilege to be permitted to study these animals. So, I guess I first should apologize for not giving a science talk, I guess. But I wrote a number of papers about these kind of topics and realized that the conservation concerns that those papers pointed towards were not necessarily being heard by the people that could actually make a difference. And so rather than writing a monograph, if you like, I tried to tell the story as to how my life interacted with, in this case, the North Atlantic right whale, and what it meant, and what the science that we did meant to the bigger question of conservation and species diversity and global change. So I've always been intrigued by whales, and they're smart, air-breathing mammals. Living in the water, sperm whales, they dive for over an hour on a single breath. But right whales too have extraordinary adaptations for eating swarms of animals that are half the size of a grain of rice. And here is a drone photograph of a North Atlantic right whale underwater, skim feeding. And you can see the individual baleen plates in the rack of baleen on the right side of its mouth. The upper jaw is here. The blowhole is in the dorsal aspect right up there, and this is the eyeball. And these white patches are callosities, the thickened skin patches covered with whale lice, cyanids, so yellow and orange color. And if you actually strip off the cyanids, you'll see a small cratered surface of keratin, much like a horse's hoof, but little quarter-sized divots wherein the whale lice hang on for their life as the whale swims along. This is the flipper here, and this is the lower jaw, and it had a huge lower lip attached to the mandible here. So this is an extraordinary, unique animal, and it's also got sort of post-cranial callosities. So this animal's called callosity back because he's got callosities on his back as well. We don't really know why. And here's the tail of that. So those individual patches, the callosities, allow us to recognize and catalog individuals. And much of this story is based upon the ability of doing that. And the North Atlantic right whale catalog has animals going back from photographs in newspapers from the 1930s, science that was done by Bill Watkins and Chevelle in Hui in the 60s, and then the New England Aquarium started up in the 1970s looking at right whales. And since then, there's been a vast consortium of scientists who've all contributed to the catalog to enable us to track the individual animals through their histories, through their lives and deaths. So it's an unusual and very well studied population of wild mammals that probably on the basis of the few hundred that are left of them, we know this species as well as any in some ways, except for our own perhaps. So this slide here gives a sense of the contrasts that I draw in the book. On the left is a photograph of a crew that I was part of working in Newfoundland in the late 70s, looking at the ecology of humpback whales. This is a guy called Hal Whitehead, who's carried on looking at the behavior ecology and behavior and general cultural aspects of marine mammals, especially in sperm whales. He's Professor at Dalhousie now. And the other crew is my wife, Hannah, now, and Kathy, and Nikki. Nikki Davis is a writer in England now. Kathy's a psychologist, and Hannah teaches music. So, we all had a really good time, as you can see, and we did a lot of work on humpback whales, and indeed witnessed a number of entanglements in cod trap nets that were set at that time when there still was an inshore fishery in coastal Newfoundland. So this is in 1979. In 1982, I landed up on this whaling ship, hiding inside the wheelhouse while the whalers were up in the roof here, and the flying bridge, shooting fin whales with explosive harpoons. And the IWC, International Whaling Commission, had asked me to look at the efficacy of these harpoons. And I didn't know it at the time, but essentially this was the sort of beginning sort of positive control, if you like, for what it takes to kill whales as a human efficiently. And, the study I did showed that the average time from pulling the trigger to killing the whale was around 2.5 minutes. And you can talk about the rigging of this thing. It's a very large fishing rod with some accumulating springs as opposed to the bendy rod. Anyway, it's another story, but it's a fascinating evolution of industrial technology. Whereas later in the book, I show that the entanglements that we witnessed in Newfoundland and subsequent have a timeline of months. So if you're a North Atlantic right whale and you get entangled in gear and it's a fatal entanglement, on average, you're going to take 6 months to die. So fairly early on, I had this sort of recognition that the anti-whaling movement had some dark sides to it, and as much as many of the people complaining about Japanese and Norwegian and Icelandic whaling were consumers of goods moved by ships that were also killing whales relatively efficiently, but also of seafood that was killing them very slowly. And so before we get all high and mighty about who's doing what and why and how and what they shouldn't be doing in the other side of the world, we probably need to take a look at what we're doing as well, which the book does, essentially. So, 4 minutes on average. I was understating. Dead fin whale on the whaling slip in Iceland. Right whale, North Atlantic right whale, with rope around its left flipper, cutting down through the left blowhole. Lots of whale lice crawling around where they shouldn't be. One of the things that we see with animals with poor prognosis is a spreading out of the whale lice away from the callosities over the tails and on the wounds as well. And this animal also had rope wrapped up inside of its baleen on the left side and came out on the right side. And I'll tell you a bit more about this animal later. And this guy here was hit by a large ship off the coast of Georgia. And most of these mortalities, if they are lethal, will be so in hours, if not minutes. And so each of these are cuts from the rotating propeller here. You can see the baleen again. And these are where a great white shark took out chunks from each of these cuts. And when we hauled it up the beach from below the low tide mark, as it beached, you could hear the air coming out of these cuts into the chest cavity. So there was no way this animal survived more than a few minutes at the most. So I guess I haven't really given you the sense of why the title. Whaling could be defined as the action, practice, and this is from the book, or business of catching whales, nothing about intent. So I guess the reason why I feel good about the title is that essentially consumers who drive the maritime industries that enable vessel collisions and fishing gear entanglements are whalers by default, but not by design. So you and I are whalers for the enactment of this particular play, if you like. So this chart in the beginning of the book gives a sense of some of the plot. I spent some time early on in my career in the Faroe Islands. Ran into a dead fin whale that wasn't supposed to be there, being killed by some locals with a harpoon. Pilot whale stranding there. Again, whaling, they drive them ashore there and have done for centuries. They kill them pretty quickly. There's been a lot of popular and academic concern about that hunt very recently. Talked about the Iceland work we did some, studied fin whales in Labrador, and humpback whales, they've said, in Beta Bird, Newfoundland, and around there. Obviously, we've done a lot of work with right whales here in more recent years. Also spent some time in the Caribbean, where the humpback whales go to breed and suckle their young. We also spent some time in North Slope Borough in Utqiagvik, what used to be called Barrow. And fascinating place, fascinating culture. And I talk about it in the book, I won't talk much more about it here, about how the relationship between the Inupiat whalers and the bowhead whale has been sustainable over thousands of years, and how they've also managed to recently conserve the habitat to a significant degree against the depredations of oil and gas in the North Slope. So it's a complex story, and what I was able to do was quote from a number of oral histories recorded at the University of Fairbanks, Alaska, that I find to be really quite moving in terms of the relationship between the humans and the whales. So, and I guess those millennia of coexistence with the bowhead come with a lesson and an attitude that we can certainly learn from over here, where we seem to have a much more rights-driven exploitation of our marine resources than perhaps the Native Americans do, in particular up in the North Slope. So really introduced the three species here of right whales. So the North Atlantic right whale today ranges from Florida to eastern Canada. It used to be that there was another whole subpopulation over in the eastern North Atlantic from the North Cape down to another second breeding area off of the Western Sahara and Central Bay. These were all wiped out in the early half of the, they had a tax levied on the baleen of right whales in Basque Country in 1150. And they were essentially commercially extinct by 1700 or that. So that's the North Atlantic right whale. Southern right whale, again, they were nailed by whalers heavily too. And by the 1930s, both the southern and the North Atlantic whale species were down to a few hundred. They've come back substantially down the south, mainly because 90% of the humans are north of the equator. So the anthropogenic trauma risks down here are still substantially less. And so they're an interesting comparison in terms of body condition and health and demographics to the North Atlantic. And then the more enigmatic and still rare North Pacific right whale is up here in the Aleutians and across into eastern Russia and Japan. So, what about entanglement here? So this is another drone photo during a blow sampling flight we did, collecting blow samples for microbiome studies and other things. These are the blowholes here, and again, you get a good view of the callosities, and this is an individually identifiable animal as a result of that. This is the baleen, and the lower jaw is dropped substantially, so that there's a big funnel of water going in through the front here. It's kind of like a plankton tail in reverse, being pushed rather than pulled. And so this mouth is a pretty good rope trap, and if you're going through the water column and this vertical line stretching from the trap of, say, a lobster trap or a crab trap up to the surface buoy, then the risk of entanglement with the animal hitting it and spinning and getting rope wrapped around here is very substantial. In fact, there's one in Florida right now called Snowcone who has recently given birth, and so she's trying to suckle an animal whilst dragging rope, and it's not a particularly good prognosis for either of them at this point. And the ability to try and intervene with an animal like that with a calf always popping up around the head is very difficult. So also when the skim's feeding like they are on the surface here, they become a very substantial vessel collision risk too, because quite often they're subsurface, maybe 2 or 3 feet under this. So it depends on where the copepod patches are densest. It's very light to feed. So that behavior gives them a real risk of vessel collision as well. So to give you a bit more of a sense of how we set trap gear up in the Northeast, this is a typical offshore and sort of further out than inshore, but not necessarily truly offshore system where they use, we call trolls of traps. So each of these is lobster trap. And they used to be tied together by the floating ground line, which we banned in 2008 to make it sink, so that at least there's not the entanglement risk of the ground line so much. They have an anchor at either end or a heavy trap. And then the end line goes up to a volleyball or just to float from the water depth. And these serve to identify the presence of the gear and also the ability to retrieve it, to service the trap, renew the bait, and pull out the keepers. So with that, we can look at what entanglement does to these animals. Sometimes they get entangled and they get straight out of it. Other times they get entangled and humans come along and disentangle them. Right whales are quite cryptic, and quite often if they're offshore, they're not reported or they're not seen. And so if they're a serious entanglement, you can get a situation where you're losing body condition over a period of months. So this is the same animal 10 months apart. Top end here is where you've got the outline of the body condition in white. And then again, you have it here. 10 months later, the animal has shrunk very substantially from the drag caused by the rope that was towing along. Sometimes you can double the drag as it compares to the surface envelope of the normal animal. As you can see, it's entangled around this flipper and also the other flipper. And through the mouth, this is the upper lip, it's closed at this point. You can see line coming out there, both sides, and a knot right in the atmosphere of the mouth on the left side, and it's dragging about 300 feet of line, which is causing ongoing scarring and trauma to the leading edge, especially of the fruit blades and also the caudal peduncle here. So with that, I'm going to tell you a story about 2301, which was the animal I showed you earlier with the entanglement over the blowhole. And I guess being trained first as a veterinarian, then as a scientist, set up a seesaw of endless good-natured conflict in my brain. Veterinarians are trained to diagnose, treat, and prevent disease, but also to advocate for their patients. Whereas the other half of my brain was the analytical scientist. And so there was a huge conflict that I explore quite a lot in the book about the extent to which I could and should tell the story about how these whales are dying, how they're in pain and suffering, as opposed to just numbers, or this animal died here for that reason, and that's what we should do about it. But ultimately, and really since I published the book, really, I resolved that anthropogenic trauma begets and deserves anthropomorphism. I'm not really sure still what I mean by that, but it sounds right. If we're going to be doing bad things to these animals and causing them pain and suffering, then we need to give them the perspective that we would have were they to be humans. I know I'm treading on pretty thin ice here as a scientist, but as a veterinarian, I feel it's okay. So there's a couple of sections in the back of the book called Postscripts, this is the voice of right whale 2301, which I try to put my head inside the head of the animal. The events that I describe are all catalogued real events, but obviously my conjecture as to the way the whales think about it is mine alone. So this is a grainy slide of 2301 with her mom. Spring 1993. Life as a young right whale calf consists of sticking close to mom and doing what she says. Sometimes when mom is feeding deeper than I want to dive, I stay nearer the surface, she comes back. Suckling is really important to get at all that oil-rich milk. Between 1994 and 2002, I hung out with my mother for about a year. It took a while to learn how to feed on my own once I wasn't getting so much milk. So I lost some weight after I was weaned. We do see that routinely with the photogrammetry. But I gradually got the idea of how to swim through the water with my mouth wide open. It's really tiring to swim like that. We have to swim very hard to make progress through the water, and we have to be very picky about where we feed so that we can lay away more energy than we expend in catching the food. Learning to find the best places to eat was tough, but I found that I have an innate sense of where to go, how to find places that we know have been bountiful in years past. I grew in length and width and hung out with other right whales in large groups. One day I realized I was pregnant. So it was time to head south to warmer waters. My first calf was born and it did well. So here she is with her own calf. 2004, once my calf was weaned, I went back to work building up my body condition, hoping to get fat enough to have another calf soon. I found good food, or some years later if I didn't. And the calving interval for a normal well-fed rat is around 3 years. But the average today is around 7, and it can go double digits sometimes. One of the things my mother had told me time and time again was to be wary of ships, boats and fishing gear. The ships were very noisy and confusing because we could hear them for hours and hours as they got closer. And we got to the point where we simply ignored them. Then usually as they went by, the noise slowly faded away again. But sometimes as it got louder and louder, the noise dropped off abruptly, which was a great but deceptive relief. My mother had explained that it meant that the bow of the ship was shielding the noise from the propeller and the engine, which were at the back of the ship. Her advice was to dive as fast as possible to avoid being hit. My mother also warned me about rope. Fishing boats had all kinds of different ropes and nets. The ones that dragged nets weren't a major threat to us, but they did a number on the fish-eating whales and dolphins. The biggest issue for us was rope that went from the surface of the ocean to the bottom, where it was attached to one or more wire mesh cages containing crabs and lobsters. We also had to watch out for long curtains of nets stretched along the bottom with weights to keep them in place and floats to keep the net standing up in the water. When I was a calf, I used to try and play with ropes and would get a serious telling off from my mom. So here she is as an adult before she gets entangled. But once I was weaned, I found it really hard to miss the ropes when I was so intent on finding the best food patch and sticking with it, twisting and turning all the while. Often I would brush against a rope running from the bottom to the surface. Usually it would just glide by, but sometimes I would get hooked up in it. I learned to stop and back off, although the temptation to twist and turn and thrash was sometimes irresistible. I picked up a few minor scars. When it happened, my calf had been weaned for less than a year, so I was still skinny and hungry all the time. I found a really good patch of food. I can't say where I was, and I ran into some fairly light line, but before I knew it, I was tangled up. I had it in my mouth over my blowhole and tightly wrapped around my left flipper. You can see the line running from its mouth over its left nostril in this image. I'm ashamed to say that I panicked. I twisted, turned, rolled, thrashed, and charged around like a crazy whale. I was able to get the trap hooked on a rock and broke that off, but I was still left with an ugly mess of rope. I could feel all the knots and twists. Every time I swam, I felt fresh stabbing pain, especially around my left flipper. I could see the rope cutting into the flesh, and eventually I felt it start cutting into the bone. My left blowhole was becoming increasingly useless. I carried that rope around for weeks and months. January 2005. My left flipper felt like it was dead. Lice had spread out around my blowhole and left flipper, and I was losing all that beautiful fat I'd been laying down for my next calf. I felt desperate. The last thing I remember was heading south to warmer water, as I was getting really cold with no fat between the water and myself. So that's the veterinary side. The science side probably relates more to cold numbers here. So the y-axis on this graph shows the number of right whales in the species. It goes from 0 to 500, and the x-axis from 1990 to 2020. Since 1990, North Atlantic right whales have slowly increased their numbers up until 2010 here, when they started a very serious decline with increased mortalities in both the US East Coast and the Canadian Maritimes, as evident in this graph, in part associated with a shift in food availability to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So here we've got some not so good news here. And this here is a right whale that was died in 2016, entangled in crab trap here. Now, crab traps are substantially heavier than lobster traps, and a loaded crab trap weighs about 1,000 pounds. They have a fair amount of surface gear as well. And this guy didn't make it. In fact, this drop-off in numbers is reflected by the fact that in this period here, the Gulf of St. Lawrence became much more favorable habitat as the Bay of Fundy became less so with the warming in the Gulf of Maine, and less food, less density of food. And so as a result, there really hadn't been the need for major conservation measures in Canadian waters up until then. And so we lost 17 whales in 2017, I think it was, and another bunch in 2019, some also in the US. So we started to recognize the unusual mortality event in the context of NOAA's program. And it's been downhill from there. It's both mortalities and also a loss of reproductive success too. We've had some bad years recently. So far this year, it's pretty good. Not all good news by any means. So another bit from the book here. Over the past millennium, the North Atlantic right whale has only just avoided extinction, first from deliberate hunting, and now inadvertently from fish harvesters and mariners. We've reached a tipping point. The right whale species cannot continue to withstand the mortality and morbidity it suffers from fishing gear entanglement and vessel collision. We must also consider what each individual is going through as it struggles with persistent rope entanglement. To solve the problem, we need to have the understanding, commitment, and optimism to carry through with what has to be done by fundamentally changing fishing and shipping practices. But we also need to make these changes in ways that are sensitive to the lives of the humans that work in vessels at sea and harvest seafood. Both industries have already borne substantial costs in the name of right whale conservation with inadequate results. Right whales are a special example of mammals that have evolved to thrive in an unforgiving environment and are specialized in diverse and remarkable ways to exploit specific aquatic resources and environments. We must be the same. The challenge is to find solutions that are sustainable, both for whales and for humans dependent on these marine industries. The missing link is consumers who do not know enough to demand a seafood product that is caught in a manner that protects whale populations and shields individual whales from the major animal welfare concern that rope entanglement entails, but also maintains viable and sustainable trap fishing industries. Were we to take the perspective of our grandchildren 50 years in the future, we might respond to our current actions in one of two ways. How could they all have been so short-sighted as to demand affordable lobster and crab rolls and cheap shipping of goods from overseas, despite the fact that they knew that the North Atlantic right whale species was headed for extinction? All that we have now are the bones of a few skeletons hanging in museums up and down the East Coast of North America. Or perhaps, finally, they saw that there was a way for whales, fisheries, and ships to coexist. It just took some legislative, regulatory, and political honesty and fortitude, enforcement of existing regulations, government investment, compromise, industrial ingenuity, and consumer education. As a scientist, I know that it is beyond urgent that we introduce much more widespread measures to mitigate large whale trauma caused by vessels and fishing gear. As a veterinarian, I see the often long, drawn-out trauma to individual right whales caused by ropes and fishing gear as utterly unacceptable. Do we have the individual and political will to make it right? Government regulations regarding how many animals can die each year are not being enforced adequately. The Endangered Species Act says you don't kill right whales, period. Well, we're doing that. The balance of political power between the seafood industry and the conservation and animal welfare lobbies is understandably heavily skewed to support the coastal communities that depend on the seafood industry for bringing cash flow to the region. Nevertheless, fishermen have been burdened and fatigued by years of whale conservation given mandatory gear modifications, while the problem of whale trauma has continued to get worse. If the government fails to make its regulations work for either the fishing industry or the whales, what can we as individuals do? So, the sketch on the left here shows how whales get entangled in end lines. The right image shows how we can replace the end line with an acoustic release, allowing a buoyant system to bring the gear to the surface when required. A record of the trap deployment location and/or the acoustics also show the owner and other trap fishers and mobile gear operators to detect the traps to avoid conflicting with them. We also need to mandate that ships slow down over much broader areas than currently. And here I read another bit from the book. Recently, my colleague Mark Baumgartner and I helped to set up a series of workshops to promote on-demand trap retrieval. The challenges for such a technology include making it compatible with a profitable fishery, both efficient as well as safe, and able to fulfill the tasks of trap retrieval and location required by all interested stakeholders. One type of system releases a coiled, bagged, or spooled rope from the trap that floats to the surface, allowing the trap to be retrieved in the traditional manner with a hauler. The spool release option is shown in the right-hand image. So here's an animation showing a lobster boat deploying a on-demand inflatable bag type trap. So the whale swims by, no end line, no entanglement risk. He comes back a while later and acoustically triggers the release of air into the bag. Now it can be hauled up by the boat. So, but the industry is heavily, and though not entirely, entrenched in current practices. The costs are currently unbearable for sure. And inefficiency and safety of fishermen are all concerns for the on-demand technologies. But there are fishermen regionally in Massachusetts, Maine, and Canada in the Gulf of St. Lawrence using this gear, some of them commercially, and it's still being developed, but it is available, and there are studies ongoing. So we're quietly optimistic, but also realistic about the challenges. So how practical is it for the fishing community? In 2021, in 2020, and now 2022, we've had a lot of support from SeaWorld and other NGOs. We've been working with fishery engineers at NOAA, NGO colleagues and fishers to deploy and refine these systems. This inshore vessel has recently triggered an inflatable buoy and is about to go along and pick it up and doing well. A particular boat has been selling ropeless caught lobster for a while now. But in summary, we must change our priorities. consumers have to demand ethical fixed fishing gear and shipping practices, or, and this is a very big or, the current socioeconomic priorities, such as survival of the coastal fisheries and affordable goods shipped by sea, stuff we all buy in Target, Walmart, will bring the North Atlantic white whale species to extinction in a few decades. And so, in many ways, it's a very quixotic slide, and I recognize that. But in many ways, it's also a microcosm of a much bigger question of global growth and capitalism and how we interact and have rights to harvest or sustainably live with and conserve. Those are the questions. And this is just one of many. But my hope is the book will raise those questions in people's minds. So thank you very much. So,
All right, thank you very much, Michael.
do you still see my slides, or have I got out of that? I'm confused here.
Oh, you're out of the slides.
Okay, great. There you go.
Any questions from anyone in the room?
And likewise, if there are any questions online, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. You can raise a hand, or you can put it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
Oh, we got one in the room.
What is your viewpoint on the televised, like, whale wars and things like that? What is your feelings toward those? Do you think that that helps?
All right, so Dr. Moore, the question was, how do you feel about those television programs that, such as whale wars, that go out and try to interfere with the whaling industry or try to show how the whaling industry is in a bad light, and how do those affect conservation of these species?
Well, I'm not sure that they necessarily go beyond what their intent is, which is to sensitize people to the perception of well, reality too, of the trauma that these animals face when they're being commercially whaled. But I wrote a review in the IC's Journal of Marine Science maybe 7 or 8 years ago, How We All Kill Whales, where I tried to, at that level, discuss the comparison between commercial whaling techniques and activities with the rather more drawn out impacts of rope entanglement through industries that are driven by a consumer demand. And I don't think that I know that those TV programs don't even begin to look at that side of things. So it is a much more nuanced question and consideration and concern than simply we should stop killing whales with explosive harpoons. I don't disagree with the fact that we should stop killing whales with explosive harpoons. Of course we should. But that doesn't mean to say that that then absolves us from any further guilt in terms of large whale conservation. In fact, it drives us away from a broader understanding. So I guess they're entertainment of some kind. I don't actually watch TV, so I wouldn't know much about that. So yeah, they're there, and they probably do engender some righteous indignation and some concern about whale conservation in general. So that's valuable, but they fall very short in terms of the reality of what's going on in terms of numbers, and both in terms of the number of whales that are entangled and how long it takes them to die and get hit by ships as well.
We have a question from Ruth Carmichael on online.
Hello, Michael. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Thank you for joining us. I actually just wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about the right whales that have been rarely seen here in the Gulf of Mexico, and if you have thoughts on why that's occurring, when it is occurring.
Yeah, well, one of the recent visitors was Snowcone. I forget, did we talk about Snowcone earlier today? She's last time she had a calf, she went up towards northern Florida on the west side there. And there's no real understanding why they do that. There's no food. But in some ways, whether they're hanging out east of Florida or west of Florida while they're suckling, it doesn't make a lot of difference to them because they're just, I guess there's more travel involved going around the bottom and around the left side there. I don't really understand it, but it's happened periodically over the decades that we've been watching them there. I think Snowcone got a pretty good headache from the amount of attention she got from kayakers and small boats on the West Coast because they're not so used to, right whale season as they are off of the northeast Florida and southeast Georgia coast, where there's a lot more management and oversight. So, certainly when a right whale does show up, they would, on the west coast there, Florida and around, they would benefit from greater public education for sure. And that's probably the biggest message, is that it'll happen again, and if the messaging is in place, it would be a good thing.
I had a question in the room, I believe. Maybe I thought I heard it.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So I guess I've got a question. So I think everyone who's a scientist wants to affect positive change using their science. So I was hoping you could talk a bit about how you decided to move more from the scientific realm, just publishing papers, and moving into the more conservation and policy side of things. What your experience is with that?
Well, you were a little bit garbled, but I think you're looking for a comment about my role as a scientist versus a conservation policy type message. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. It's a real struggle, and I talk about it in the book. So, we did some good descriptive pathology, if you like, forensics. Where forensics is, I think, technically wrong because often there's no crime being investigated. But the analysis of how these animals were dying, what the causes were, what the clinical conditions were that the trauma represented, and so on. We published all of that quite extensively over the last 20 years, myself with many other colleagues. And even early on in that, I felt, and I talk about it in the book, somehow incomplete. Dessert was missing because I gave a talk at a marine mammal meeting in San Diego in the 2000s and about the clinical aspects of chronic entanglement, and everybody got up and left the room and went on to the next talk. Like, oh, a minute, there's more to this than that. We've got a problem here which we need to fix, and that sort of empty stomach feeling of, oh, there's more to this than just the science. And the science was so important because they could take it and justify the regulations that were being enacted and hopefully enforced, but not adequately for sure. So much through the first 2/3 of my career as a scientist, I had a veterinary training at the same time. I was, as I said earlier, the balance between the analyst and the advocate as a veterinarian was always tense. But I felt grateful that I had the veterinary training as well, because it allowed me to, professionally be involved in pain and suffering and the alleviation of that. So, and the alleviation of that for a right whale is essentially the conservation policy work that needs to be done. And so, in many ways, the arc of my career began as a diagnostic veterinarian. We did some treatment, worked on getting sedation systems set up so we can enable disentanglement. It's always been a challenge, but it has helped somewhat through prevention. And so in many ways, that close to retirement and focusing much more now on the policy and the conservation issues. 10 years is a wonderful thing in that regard. So, but I should also say that all the way through this, the folks within the executive role at WHOI have been enormously supportive of the somewhat off-track trail that I've led through my career, and internal support for some pretty wacky things that we did. It was very consistent, and I should be very, very grateful for that. And so I think one of the things I found, especially in writing this book, is how many straight-laced, straight up and down academic colleagues I have made very positive comments about the way the book reads and what I was talking about. And I think there's this expectation that we're all straight up and down objective and cool cutting numbers, but we're all humans. And I think it's important to recognize that. And I also think that there is a much broader than just me recognition of the role that scientists have to play in the softer aspects of these situations. And the right whale problem is fundamentally a socioeconomic political problem. It's not a science problem at this point. And so, feel out of my depth in those kinds of disciplines. But I've spent a fair amount of time in courtrooms over the last few years. And when I start wanting to talk about economics, I get out of my zone, and that's pretty obvious. And that's frustrating because so I can't really tell you what to do. But take what skills you have and speak to your discipline, but also look to other companion disciplines of which significance is there. So it's an interesting challenge and balance, but don't be shy, I guess, is the deal. And I could say, I was on a call earlier this morning for a very, very tense hearing within the state of Massachusetts, marine fisheries. Question of whether or not a permit should be permitted for some fishermen to fish on demand gear in a closed area for right whale work. And I decided I wasn't going to say anything, even though I had some very strong opinions, because I was kind of off my plank, as it were. And turns out that they were being very selective who they were taking on in terms of question of hands raised. So there's lots of politics, and it's very complicated sometimes. It's very hard, and you start to feel very vulnerable too. I was an independent witness for a pretty substantial court case recently, and it's very uncomfortable, especially when you land up in a court with colleagues with different opinions. It's very complicated. But you do what you think is right and speak the truth, and if you don't know the answer, you don't answer it.
We have also a question on chat. Is whaling in Alaska still legal for Native Alaskans? I've heard conflicting reports. If so, how many are allotted?
Well, the answer to the first question is yes. There is an Aboriginal quota issued by the International Whaling Commission, and I don't have the number for you, but basically each whaling village, and they're recognized by the IWC and by NOAA, along the North Slope and again around the corner into the Bering Strait. It's not the Bering Strait, it's on the left side of Alaska there. And it's, depending upon the size of the village, they have different quotas. I think Uktiavik, which is the largest, which used to be Barrow, I think maybe they have 17 a year, but I don't know the numbers of that sort of scale. And certainly they're within the capacity of the population species to sustain that. But yeah, so the answer is yes, they do. And it's a food fishery that's non-commercial. And one of the biggest challenges is that they currently use ice cellars to maintain the meat through the season, and warming, rising permafrost levels has made it harder for them to use that natural freezer capacity. So and they're also getting a lot of surface erosion from reduced ice cover, letting storms wipe out the beach fronts and so on. So global change is very, very marked for those people. It's complicated. Very.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, we definitely, would like to extend our appreciation for coming to join us. This has been a great turnout, and for some of us, it's been very new learning about whales, or as I call them, charismatic megafauna. And this has been a great time. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And second printing is out in the book. You can get it from the University of Chicago Press or from Amazon. And there's a Kindle version as well, paperback in the fall. So let me know what you think.
Definitely is an interesting read. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.